بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Welcome everybody to the first Thinkbites live event that we've ever had. It's live now because due to COVID and whatnot, this is the maximum. This is the same as filling a full stadium full of people, alhamdulillah. So we're really excited, alhamdulillah, to be having Dr. Tarek Younis joining us. He wrote one of our inaugural posts, Suffering Unto God, which was an article about reframing anxiety and how we think about anxiety and bringing us close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is the featured article, and he's the featured contributor, alhamdulillah, on the Thinkbites page right now. And so, first of all, Dr. Tariq, assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the show.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakallah khair for having me. Barakallahu feekum, Thinkbites and Tariq and everyone else involved for all your work. May Allah reward you all. And yeah, I'm really excited for today's discussion, inshallah.
Alhamdulillah, Jazakallah khair. Yeah, so the idea with this conversation was pretty broad. Alhamdulillah, for those of you guys who don't know, I'm going to share Dr. Tariq's bio very briefly. And his bio, mashallah, extends beyond this, but this is kind of going to give you a little bit, at least, of a start for those of you who might not be familiar. If my document decides to open up. MashaAllah. Okay, so it's not. So I'm going to introduce it off the top of my head. Dr. Tariq is a cultural, critical, and clinical psychologist. I'm using all three because all three have been used. And you are currently based in the UK. You are a lecturer at Middlesex University, I believe. And you're a lecturer in psychology. You do a lot of work around kind of the field of addressing Islamophobia, racism, and quote unquote counter radicalization, and the intersection of basically these factors of Muslim mental health and radicalism and whatnot. Alhamdulillah, we had the privilege of having you write about anxiety, of course, for Thinkbites. But actually, before we go into that, I want to kind of give a little bit of a background of how we got connected. So I looked through our WhatsApp messages, and I think our first messages that we had on WhatsApp were in May 2019. Before that, we had talked on Twitter. So I think I remember seeing your profile before, and I looked at your the link in your bio, and I was like, let me just see what this blog is about, because I was like, okay, you're Muslim, you're a psychologist, that automatically has my interest. And so I remember looking at the blog on your website, and you had a few articles that related to basically topics that relate to kind of general Muslim mental health. And I remember reading it, and I was like, this is so much better than a lot of the generic stuff that I've come to see and hear about mental health in Muslims. Unfortunately, sometimes like our dialogue has been so behind in some spaces where, on one side you have people who are saying things like, all you need is the Quran and all you need is prayer, and that's fine. And then on the other hand, you have people who will say, well, the brain is, the brain is just like, your arm. And so if your arm is broken, you go to a doctor. So if your brain is broken, why don't you just go to a therapist or a psychologist? And often it's a very simplistic way of talking about these very complicated and interdisciplinary topics. And so I remember just the way that you approached the content was very comprehensive without being overly wordy, and it was very accessible. I could tell. I was like, for me as a normal person reading that content, I was like, I benefited. This helped me rethink some of these concepts. So I remember hitting you up on Twitter, and I was just like, Jazakallah khair, this stuff is awesome. And then as we got Thinkbites started, you were one of the first people that I reached out to just to give general advice about how we should be approaching these things. And I remember seeing in your bio that you are a critical psychologist. And I remember you kind of talking a little bit about this. Didn't really understand it at that time. I understand it a little bit more now, but can you just elaborate on basically how you would define yourself, your work in psychology, and who you are?
So, bismillah wa sallam. Yeah, I mean, first of all, let me just go ahead and say that if you gave me that bio off the top of your head, mashallah, that's 100 times better than anything I'm able to conjure in the heat of the moment. I'll be honest with you, I often lose myself in trying to describe exactly what I'm doing and what sort of work I'm engaged in. So that was really fantastic, and I'm really glad this is recorded because now I can just sort of write it out while you explained it. And yeah, I mean, I think you're missing out on a particular moment, or maybe just a particular, I guess, narrative point in our history together, is that I've been following your posts, and I think, mashallah, you know, you give really great reminders and these sort of spiritual boosts and things like that online, and I've really benefited from that. So in a way, that's really integral to the story. And finally, if from now on, I might just recommend that you just call me Tarek, um, or you can call me Master Chief. So you have to choose between the two. I'm just going to put you on the spot. All right. So you're going to have to choose either between Tarek or Master Chief. Dr. Tarek is probably a sort of formality that we don't need for this sort of conversation and everyone listening in. So yeah, khair, how I see myself as a critical psychologist. Wow, subhanAllah. I mean, I think in a way, the reason why I put critical psychologist on my bio is that when people see the word critical, they immediately assume someone who's not at least fully regurgitating, you know, the status quo, you know, status quo discussions on psychology, on mental health. And I think it's a way of inviting people in to me, into my work, that doesn't really tell them anything about me, you know? So just being critical, I think everyone would assume a certain sense of criticality. I'm just putting it forward just to go ahead and sort of invite that type of relationship, that, oh, Tarek is critical, he's a critical psychologist. In practice, or at least within psychology, critical psychology is itself, I guess you can say, sort of a subfield. It's not really concrete, but it inherently, you know, it encompasses so many various thinkers and scholars, of people who are critical of what we would call normative structures, normative understandings of psychology, right? The type of psychology that, for example, dismisses things outside the individual. You know, how to really appreciate for politics, how do we appreciate for social roles, how do we appreciate for Eurocentrism in psychology, you know, how do we understand all these things? So there's really nothing that binds people who are critical together other than actually just being critical towards normative forms of psychology. But if you actually probably put them all in the same room together, they might all fight and disagree.
So yeah, that makes sense. In the realm of, I guess, in comparison, let's say mainstream psychology. So I
Yeah.
guess maybe one question that I guess I'd put forward to you there, without making this over too much of an interview, is there a particular reason why, you know, you feel that need to come at things a little bit more critically, specifically in the realm of psychology?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think this sort of brings it back to who I am in my history. Now, you're probably not inviting me to like speak about myself, but I'm just going to go ahead and do that anyway.
No, it's very much an invite to speak about yourself.
Okay, sounds good. So alhamdulillah, you know, I come from a background of being invested, you know, in community work. You know, my family had been long invested in community work, and I'm sort of following in their footsteps. So, you know, everything that people might know, people who are listening, you know, Muslim Students Associations, but even just before that, being part of youth clubs, Muslim youth clubs, etc. So I think there was a point in my life where I realized, well, you know, there's all these issues among youth, and there's really, there's no psychologists. So that was just a really basic sort of, you know, drive to be like, okay, maybe I'm just going to go ahead and try to fill some sort of gap. Now, this filling of gaps, the spirit of filling in the gaps, is something that I've always held on to, right? So I think this is really important in my trajectory, because it's easy to just say, okay, I'm a psychologist and therefore I'm a filler of gaps. But that's not necessarily true. What my intention, you know, the dua that I make, is that Allah puts me always in a position that's always a filler of gaps. And that may not necessarily be one which inherently is, you know, is a given just because I'm a psychologist, right? And I think that's something that I can elaborate on. But I think, alhamdulillah, it was really through a whole range of blessings and privileges and also my own interests, it sort of developed naturally that I became a cultural psychologist. So I became very interested in how people suffer differently across the world. So there's these concepts like idioms of distress, that people just experience suffering differently, people express their suffering differently. That led me down sort of the type of work during my psychology training, which has a lot to do with migrants and refugees. And I think there, when you're sort of in that field, you tend to be exposed to a certain level of criticality of at least Eurocentric concepts. So there was already that as a basis. But I also had really great supervisors. I had a lot of fantastic mentors who really they would just, they would just like throw books at me, and I'll be like, yeah, just, give me this to read, give me that to read. And, we'd be in constant discussion, and we still are today. So there was this inherent criticality that comes from looking at things from a cultural perspective, because there's a sort of cultural perspective within psychology whereby you take Western psychology as a norm and you sort of impose it in certain ways to other people in the world, or people coming from other sides of the world here to the West or the global North. But there's also a sort of cultural psychology, and this is a different form of cultural psychology, whereby you're actually now unpacking all the various ideologies, all the various industries, all the various ways in which you actually come to realize that Western psychology, or modern psychology, as we understand it and practice it, is actually a Western artifact of many different things. And I actually teach on this. So often when I'm teaching students, we're going to look at capitalism, we're going to look at imperialism, we're going to look at all these various sort of grand historical trajectories and their influence on psychology. So there's inherent level of criticality there. But I think what binds it to a whole different field that people might know me. So people listening in, depending on how they know me, they might be like, oh, I didn't even know Tarek talks about these things. A lot of people might know me also from Islamophobia work, and I write a lot on Islamophobia. And that's because during my PhD, sort of bridging the two of culture and psychology, all of this for me had always been around, how do we protect Muslims? What's going on with Muslims? I guess how to protect them is probably the easiest way to summarize it. And so my PhD was looking at how Muslims develop across the global North, how they develop their identity. And there was a certain level of criticality there that came from really understanding Islamophobia beyond just like these hate crimes. How do we understand Islamophobia as a way of almost, probably the best way of saying it is almost trying to manufacture a very sort of ideal Muslim way of being, that Muslims are those who are productive to society, they develop vaccines, for the rest of the world. There's all these sort of ideal Muslims, and that's now bringing in politics into like mental health, right? So to summarize, I think your question going now, I think a full circle, it was all these various trajectories from research, sort of from my clinical background, and my own experience with working with youth, and I still work, with various NGOs and community groups. That brings me down to sort of summarizing my work, which it's very tough to disentangle between clinical work, research, and community work. Is sort of the intersection between race, or Islamophobia, Muslims, politics, and mental health, and that all of that sort of bridges in together.
There's a lot that I want to jump into there. And the first one is specifically this concept of Islamophobia. Oftentimes that word is perceived differently from different people. Sometimes Islamophobia to some people is like, oh, you should just toughen up. What somebody said that you look like this, or that your family is that, it's not a big deal. This is just a threat to our body, whereas other ideologies or other groups, they are a threat to our soul. And you'll have these ways of kind of, people will define Islamophobia the way that they want to, in order to make a broader argument, let's say, about how they view themselves or their place in society. And so I'm interested in knowing, first of all, when you say Islamophobia, um, with that term, maybe if you have a definition that works for you, if you could share that, that would be helpful. And maybe the second part of that would be to ask you is, do you think that the word itself inherently has shortcomings, or that there are, let's say, warranted criticisms about the term, and maybe that there might be a term that is better used? And I'm not saying that, by the way, with any assumptions in or any of my own opinions on this, because the way that I've seen it very often, you have to kind of take into consideration the context in which this word first developed. And so Islamophobia was never, to my understanding, a word that started from Muslims talking to other Muslims, saying, you are dealing with Islamophobia. It came from a broader context of coalition building and activism and trying to address systemic issues and the interaction between Muslims and non-Muslims. So if you can give us some of your thoughts on that, inshallah.
Khair, mashallah. I mean, you went right for the hot stuff, right? I mean, you skip straight to the spicy food. Usually there's a trail of appetizers, but you just gave me like one appetizer, introduce myself, and now we're just gonna go ahead and
You're Master Chief. You're Master Chief. The bar has to be set high.
Okay, inshallah. I mean, I think there's a number of things in the question. And I think there's a lot of your question I probably can't answer right now in a nutshell, because a part of it has to do with history. Part of it has to do, okay, how have Muslims conceptualized their discrimination, their oppression. And of course, we know that there's nothing new in Muslims seeing it as a form of racism, for example. Before I get into that definition, we know here in the 70s and 80s, if you come to East London, where a Bangladeshi young man was killed, and all the different sort of uprisings that were happening, the protests against racism that were happening here in London, I mean, decades ago. Islamophobia was really only sort of formalized as a sort of concept. It existed a long time before that, but I think the sort of iteration we're often referring to comes from the mid-90s. Now, when we're talking about Islamophobia, it's really important to begin with one thing. And this, in fact, sort of evades your question completely, but I'm not doing that politically. I'm doing that because this is a really important point for me. It doesn't really matter how we define it. And there's a point here where people get stuck on definitions, assuming there's some perfect form of a definition out there. And that the perfection of a definition will be sufficient to translate into actual change, right? So we know that anyone who has any sort of basic reading in social science will know that that's not true. If you look at things like extremism or counter-extremism, extremism doesn't have a definition, but there's total sort of infrastructures built around counter-extremism. There's so much built around, like, in terms of policies, in terms of actual jobs, in terms of education, without actually really defining a term, or without being in full agreement between the definitions of terms. And that applies also to terrorism. But even if we go outside of security, it applies to issues of identity. When I did my PhD in identity, I clocked that in the 80s, there were over 100 definitions of identity. But that never changed any of the policies surrounding, let's say, integration of Muslims or assimilation theories, things like that, that like Muslims have to, you have to portray that sort of national identity. You have to be a British Muslim, you have to be a Canadian Muslim. So, even though, or you have to have a British identity, you have to have a Canadian identity, even though identity itself was never defined, it's able to have that sort of impact. And the reason why is because there's power behind it. You can sort of almost will it into existence. You can just do things, you just work towards it. So the reason why I start off that way is because I think, in a way, we do get stuck in definitions. And I think there's an issue there, because if we get stuck in definitions, yeah, by the way, I should also include in mental health, well-being. You know, how do you define well-being? You know, when you actually get down to trying to define well-being, you'll actually recognize very easily it's a normative, i.e., it's a value-based word, right? So it depends on the sort of the values of society. How are we going to define well-being, etc. You know, it's not like, oh, I have well-being now after A, B, and C, right? Well-being is really just like, you know, it depends on how we're defining it towards a certain policy in the moment. So to dial that back, for me, Islamophobia, what's really important is to recognize that Islamophobia, as any form of racism, exists for a purpose. All right. And the reason why Islamophobia or racisms or anything like that exists is because someone somewhere is benefiting from it. If no one was benefiting from the oppression of Muslims or the discrimination of Muslims or the exclusion of Muslims or the othering of Muslims, then we wouldn't have Islamophobia. Okay. So one of the central things that, you know, I try to remind myself and others when we're talking about Islamophobia is, in a way, one of the things we need to keep our eye on are those who are benefiting from Islamophobia. Who benefits from othering Muslims? And that immediately sets out our goal of what we're actually working towards. You see what I mean? In really concrete terms, we're saying that, oh, here, these politicians, these industries, you know, the war on terror is incredibly Islamophobic. But why? How does it benefit? Well, obviously through othering of Muslims, it can justify the military-industrial complex, et cetera, right? Previously, Islamophobia was justified, even if not through the terms of Islamophobia, but, you know, through Orientalism, saying, oh, these women there need, like through Orientalist sort of theories, these women need civilizing. So that justifies our imperialism, because from a civilizational perspective, and you have to excuse me for really eating up that term, you know, we're better. Our civilization is better than theirs, right? And inherently, that carries forth until today. So when a Muslim woman goes to seek therapy, one example I like to give here is a woman, I know a Muslim woman who went to seek therapy, okay? And for a traumatic experience that she had. And her white male therapist told her that one of the signs of successful treatment will be her ability to take off her niqab. Okay, so one of the signs of her successful treatment will be her ability to take off niqab. And obviously, for her, that was incredibly discriminatory, right? It was an Islamophobic experience. Okay. But now, from what I was talking about before, you can see how I'm drawing a history. I'm drawing a trajectory to trying to explain where that even comes from. That she's seen as oppressed, okay, right? She's seen as she is belonging to sort of a misogynistic ideology, one that oppresses women, okay. Where does that come from? That comes from a longer discourse, whereby it was the West versus the rest, right? And that had a particular logic to it to be able to justify very concrete materialistic gains. So it's that point whereby, you know, and I apologize for perhaps dragging it on to what might potentially sound like a tangent for longer than than you would have imagined that I was going to do right now. But the reason why I emphasize that is because I think if we all keep our eye on the ball in terms of who's benefiting, you know, how is Islamophobia reproduced, then we, you know, we might not need that perfect definition. But now to answer your question, I am technically fine with the APPG definition, which was here in the UK. So it was sort of a definition that was proposed to the British Parliament, which sort of uh, reduces, and I'll say it reduces, Islamophobia to this, racism towards Muslimness and perceived Muslimness. And the reason why Muslimness is used is because we know Sikhs have been attacked for being perceived as Muslims or Christian, Coptic Egyptians. I think that definition is very limited. It doesn't encapsulate the issue with Islam as a religious other in the global north. What we're seeing from Macron in France, and if we're going to include China, we're going to include Myanmar, we're going to go around the world, we're going to see that there's a particular aversion to Islam as a thing that has to be overtly stated. And my other issue with the definition is that it doesn't really tell us who's benefiting and how they're benefiting from it, right? And I think that's one of the other things. But I'll leave it at that. I don't know how much of your question I just answered, but if you feel like there's a part where like you want to like unpack or you want to challenge me on, you can go ahead and do that, inshallah.
No, that was fantastic. Jazakallah khair. I'm not just saying that because I agree or because because of anything else. I do think that we have an issue of sometimes getting overly stuck on meanings and definitions and debates, particularly, let's say, in the realm of social media and maybe even sometimes in the realm of maybe even academia to an extent, where there is work on the ground that needs to be done that legitimately is not given the attention it needs because the people are getting overly invested in the wrong aspects of it. And in situations like this where there's very clearly harms being done actively, maybe it's not out of place to say that no, it is wrong to overly emphasize a certain attention on certain places, as opposed to just saying, well, everybody should kind of be in their own realm or in their own this. That obviously is always true to an extent, but at the same time, we're seeing that Islamophobia obviously it's so much more than just a mean word. It's so much more than just a potential quote unquote bully. It's something that's systematic and systemic. And so from what I got from what you said then is that when we talk about Islamophobia, and especially to those who perceive it only to be, let's say, a bodily harm or a bodily threat, what you're saying is essentially it's tied to the conception of identity. And that same idea of identity then ties into the idea of well-being, the idea of how valid your citizenship is, right? Or how how legitimate you are, how legitimate your claim is to a certain land or to a certain place or whatever it is. And so these ideas, I see like how interconnected they are. And I want to kind of jump into then that aspect then that you talked about. You talked, of course, about the idea of being the good Muslim, the idea of well-being, etc. Can you elaborate a little bit more about the idea of being that good Muslim? I know for a lot of us, especially when we first, and I know, subhanAllah, I believe, at least for myself, right, that I have a fairly let's say confident stance in my Muslim identity. I'm proud to be a Muslim, and I have no problem talking about Islam in and out of Muslim spaces. And but I know, for example, having certain conversations with people on campus and or academics, especially people who are, let's say, doing work targeted at Muslims or about Muslims. When they themselves are not Muslims, sometimes I remember one time, for example, there was a non-Muslim academic who was talking to me about the idea of secularism and how Muslims think of secularism and whatnot. And I remember just thinking, I was like, I feel like I need to preemptively mention that I'm a good Muslim. Like I'm one of the good ones. Like I'm not, when we talk about this and that, it's like, I'm like, oh, I believe in like, equal rights and this, and like feeling the need to give these disclaimers, not because I want to validate the implications of the, or the, let's say the subliminal implications of the conversations, but because there's like a legitimate harm that it's like, if I don't say this, or if I don't represent this view, I'm going to be making a martyr of myself, and maybe that's not necessary, and maybe that's not something I want to fall on. And so maybe it's easier for me to just say, hey, like I condemn terrorism too, and I'm, yeah, ISIS sucks. And so can you just speak a little bit to this and to the feeling that a lot of us have? that even if we don't want to validate the ideology behind it and the systems that create these feelings, what that actually means to kind of embrace that and to try to challenge that.
Yeah, mashallah, Barak Fik for sharing that. And I think that experience that you had is one which I think many share, and I think even the most confident Muslims will inevitably have to confront that sort of reality where they're like, look, I want you to know that I'm a good guy. So anyway, I think let me circle back to that question, because the way I think for us to understand this whole good Muslim, bad Muslim dynamic is actually to understand maybe one element of the definition of Islamophobia, which I didn't elaborate on, which is about racism. Because I think often the challenge to thinking about Islamophobia as a form of racism is that, like, oh, well, Muslims aren't a race. So there we have to sort of respond, well, actually, all of race and racism is constructed as well. But let's put that aside. The reason why, well, there's two, let's say, I'm going to just explain two reasons why we often use racism. One has to do with, as Salman Saeed explains, we talk about Islamophobia as a form of racism because it makes it understandable to the wider public. And if there's any form of shift that needs to happen, people can understand how people are discriminated against in terms of their Muslimness, in terms of their appearance, through signifiers, the beard, the hijab, or through Muslim behaviors. Okay. That's really important to the good Muslim, bad Muslim dynamic, which I'm going to get to. But, another part that's really important, and this is far more central to the dynamic, is, well, why is racism so central, right? Like, why do we think about it in terms of racism? And there, people often misunderstand what is meant by racism, because people often think that racism is something that belongs to certain individuals in society, right? So we think about the far right, we think about just people who are racist, so they are racist, right? Rather than racism being inherently a logic which structures society. And the reason why that difference is so important, because if we start understanding how racism is a logic which structures society, we begin to understand through European history up until today, all the politics we're seeing right now. We're seeing a growth of nationalism. Nationalism across the global north is inherently associated with whiteness. This is something when Hannah Arendt, a philosopher, when she was commenting on what happened in World War II Germany, she said, the nation killed the state, right? What happened is that nationalism has taken over. The reason why nationalism is inherently associated with whiteness as normal is because, there's probably a longer description here that I can give, but in short, in the public's imagination of what it means to be Canadian, what it means to be Quebecois, what it means to be British, it associates whiteness as the status quo, as the sort of de facto principle. That's why someone like Nigel Farage, the Brexit politician, when he was out to make a point that we don't want illegal, we don't want migrants, actually, we want to be able to control our borders. He's talking about protecting British borders. He's talking about Fortress Britain, but he's not standing in front of a poster of like a bunch of like white Scandinavians, like he's not standing in front of a poster of like white Danes, right? He's standing in front of a poster of non-white, people, non-white looking people who are most likely Muslim, they're racialized as Muslim, that people would immediately understand. So the good Muslim, bad Muslim dynamic inherently comes from a place whereby it's already sort of understood that we don't fully belong, right? You see, even just the logic that I'm talking about, we never really fully belong. And whereas the sort of illiberal discrimination. You know, you were talking about the violence before, right? And I used to consult for the police in Montreal for 5 years, and we would talk about that violence all the time, women getting their hijab ripped off and things like that. Now, this isn't something I would do again in terms of consultation. It actually dissolved. It's a long story. But anyway, that's a sort of illiberal racism that we're seeing, right? Illiberal racism is that sort of racism whereby like, oh, I hate all Black people and I hate all Muslims, right? And like, let's just kick them all out. Whereas one Danish politician says, you know, let's parachute, he actually said this, let's parachute all Muslims out of Denmark. He said that like last year or something, like, so this is not like, you know, that sort of sentiment is alive and well, that wholesale demonization. But what's transformed, especially in a post-World War II period, is liberal racism. This is the racism that we're talking about. We're talking about good Muslim, bad Muslim, is that it allows, so we've taken now for granted that Muslims and non-white populations don't inherently belong, right? But they're not inherently to be demonized either, because they're deserving of rights in some shape or form. But now there has to be certain registers of being able to determine who belongs and who doesn't belong. And that's how we come back to nationalism, because nationalism then becomes a way of differentiating. It's like a burden on our shoulders. It's like something cleaving you constantly in half. Not in half, but something that's cleaving you, whereby you're almost under strain of always having to constantly prove your loyalty, right? Yes, you know, like I don't fully belong. So the liberal racism will come in whereby a Muslim who doesn't, or even worse, resists their belonging, you know, they resist their Britishness, they resist their Quebecois-ness, you know, or all these various national identities, you know, they immediately fall into this bad Muslim camp, right? Which in today's language, we're talking about extremism, we're talking about a lot of various things to be able to explain that they don't belong to us. When we call a Muslim an extremist, what we're really trying to say is that they don't belong to us, right? So it's not a wholesale demonization like the KKK or the Nazis used to do. But through liberal racism, we see registers like nationalism. So Muslims have to constantly prove that, hey, I'm on your side, right? And that's how I'm accepted. There's also capitalism. Capitalism has to do then with being productive migrants. You know, the type of migrants, as I said before, who develop vaccines, you know, who contribute economically to society, you know? But then if they don't, well, there again, we see how easily the narrative shifts to like, well, why are you here? You know, these people are sort of leeching off society. They're leeching all our benefits. They're leeching our benefits. You know, they could be citizens for all of that matters, but they're leeching our benefits because, again, you know, nationalism, capitalism sort of intertwine. And that's where the good Muslim, bad Muslim dynamic comes, but it doesn't belong to Muslims. It could be the good immigrant, bad immigrant. You know, it could be the good, you know, Black youth, it could be the bad Black youth, you know, all these come from the exact same source. And I know I probably spent too long explaining this, but I'll just really quickly plug in the book, which I think I'm assuming you're going to get to. I Refuse to Condemn is a book that was edited by Asim Qureshi. I highly encourage everyone who's watching to purchase the book. My chapter has been made available online, which we can share, inshallah, which talks about this dynamic if you're still interested. But, you know, I'm just going to throw the ball back to you.
Yeah, barakallah fiqh. Tariq, / Master Chief. So for those actually who registered for the event, alhamdulillah, and who are in the Zoom call with us right now, in the email that we sent out earlier today, we actually included a purchase link to the book, as well as a link to the article that was the published chapter that in this context, you're Dr. Tarek Younis. Outside in the Zoom call, you're Master Chief. Outside of it, it was written by Dr. Tarek, and it's a fantastic chapter. I read it, and we could have done literally 2 hours of a conversation just based on that. But I will say this, subhanallah. So the article that was written, "Suffering Unto God," was written a few months ago, and then just recently the book was published, and recently the article was published, and you've been also doing I'd say, you know, probably a lot of events, mashallah, related to this topic, and so it's kind of funny how like things just overlap like this, subhanallah. But yeah, so if you check out Dr. Tariq on social media and whatnot, you'll find quite a few more talks and kind of other resources that elaborate about this. But yeah, the book is I Refuse to Condemn. It's edited by Dr. Asim Qureshi. And it has quite a few essays written by a pretty large and diverse panel of people, mashallah, on the, you know, on basically a lot of what we've kind of talked about today. Now, I wanted to kind of transition this back a little bit. So the idea of, you know, that good Muslim, bad Muslim, you're talking about how basically, you know, these forces, things like capitalism, racism, Islamophobia, etc., they are putting a constant pressure on Muslims to behave in a certain way and to conceptualize themselves in a certain way. And I think the relationship between that and psychology, that and therapy, that relationship, I think, is very clear without a need to maybe spell it out more specifically than already has been done. But I am interested in talking a little bit more about this idea of, you know, the anxiety that results from these forces that build up in us. Uh, a lot of these things are, I would say, latent. You know, we're not aware that these things are constantly putting pressure on us until maybe it results in something that is often so monumental, so clearly deviated from one's perception of their self or what their perception of what they want to be. They suddenly find themselves doing something that is like, wait, that's not who I am. And sometimes it takes kind of a certain barrier being broken internally, you know, something happening where it's like, wait a minute, like I was able to take these small steps away from, let's say, my desired identity, not to attribute any moral value to that, because of course we know it's a complicated thing. But the idea being that we have an identity, and then, you know, there's pressures, external and internal, that can sometimes push us in a certain direction, and suddenly sometimes you find yourself, yo, this is not where I expected myself to be. And I wanted to speak a little bit about how these forces build up, let's say, they create an effect, let's say, on our well-being, as loose as that term is. And I just want to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, mashallah. That's a really good question. Look, I don't know if you'd appreciate me sort of throwing back this question to you, because you shared a moment, I think, rather courageously. I think often we don't like to talk about these moments where we feel like, oh, we got to play a good Muslim. I mean, what did you feel in that moment that you shared with me earlier? You know, how did you feel in that moment, you know, when you felt like, you know, there was sort of this pressure, or whatever you want to call it, to play the good Muslim?
So I would say there's maybe a couple things I should maybe say preemptively, and I won't take too long on this, inshallah, because I'm here to hear more from you than from myself. But subhanallah, I have a benefit of, until somebody knows my name, I can pass as being sort of white enough. And obviously we know that a name in itself could be, you know, could have, you know, effects on people. And so that's not to say that, you know, the effects of racism or Islamophobia are not experienced. But I know if I like walk into a store, I'm not going to be looked at like, you know, a black person. You know what I mean? It's just not going to be the same. And so I say this to say that I've had experiences where white people have thought I was white and have said racist things. Like I remember there was I had an Indian supervisor at a place that I worked a few years ago, and a white employee came in and she was talking about like how this guy smelled and like making racist comments about him, like, oh, like he probably eats this and does this. And I was just like, she's like that's just like how they are. And I just remember I was like, I turned around, I was like, I'm Muslim. Like that's all I said. And I was like, and she's like, oh yeah, like I'm not like saying anything. Like the guy wasn't even Muslim. He's not Muslim. But I was just like, I just wanted to like make her feel a little bit just uncomfortable with like how. And I also like I didn't plan it out. It was just in the moment. I was just like, I didn't know how else to react except to say, yo, I'm not one of you. Like if you think that I'm on your side of doing this, And it's not to say, of course, that we don't. And I say this cautiously because I know I have, for example, white Muslim friends who have talked about how they feel alienated when non-white Muslims talk derogatorily or generalize about white people, and they're like, these are our brothers and our sisters and our aunts and our uncles, and we want to bring them to Islam, and we need you guys to be patient with them, etc. So I totally understand that, but at the same time, it's like sometimes in those moments, like you mentioned, it's like you are almost surprised that you ended up in a place where you saw something, you experienced something. And so I'll just say my general, I remember actually mentioning this to the academic. I mentioned to her that I said, at the end of the day, a lot of the effects of Islamophobia that I've felt have been, I'm not aware of them all the time in my day to day, but I know for a fact the way that I operate, I have to constantly, for example, operate under the assumption that there is some sort of entity that's watching me, supervising me, and making sure that I'm not saying something out of line. And I know for myself, not to use the good Muslim label, but I'm a good Muslim. Like I'm good Muslim in the sense of we all have our shortcomings in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and
Spiritual
whatnot.
sense.
But
Yeah.
exactly. But on the identity level, it's like, no, man, like I'm not a terrorist. I'm not a this. I'm not a that. I condemn terrorism, all these things. But it's like, I'm also very aware that like I almost have to say that stuff and I have to make these claims known. And I can't say anything. I'm risking my career, right? And I'm risking my life if I say anything that toes the line too careful. It doesn't, toe the line carefully enough. And I know that's a stress that amounts to, not being able to. It's just something that's kind of subliminally there all the time, and I can imagine, for example, for a Muslim woman, that is probably way worse. Where you also have these the more visible appearance. If you are a black Muslim, let's say, or even somebody who's like more brown than I am, I can imagine that those things these things play up much more significantly, and that goes into. I mean, could we say that is a form of anxiety?
Well, yes. I think we could definitely say it's a form of anxiety. I mean, I think depends on to what extent I think it's sort of felt. I'll be honest, a lot of things I think are also quite normalized. We've normalized a society, let's say a meritocracy, that like, oh, I'm succeeding by my own individual sort of effort, rather than there being 100 billion blessings and privileges that come down upon us from Allah that can take anything away. So I think there's a lot of things that are normalized that people don't question. And so I do believe for anyone who's remotely aware of that gaze upon them, then yes, I would say there's a form of anxiety there. Remember, anxiety is, first of all, let me mention two things, okay? The two things I'm going to mention is something called affective surveillance. The other one, we're going to talk about anxiety. And I think maybe that bridges perhaps into the Thinkbites article that that's on the website. So affective surveillance is sort of this emerging term. There's a lot of research that's not being done. I got to be really honest with you. A lot of research on Muslim mental health is it's quite standard, I'll say, right? So it's asking, I think, the very broad sort of questions of having experienced discrimination overtly in some shape or form, and what impact that has on mental health, right? I don't think there you're going to find an answer to your question. The concept of affective surveillance has to do with this. Affective means emotions, and surveillance means you're being sort of watched, right? And I think there's this heightened sort of embodied experience of being seen. That I think anyone listening in immediately sort of understands that, right? Fine, we can't totally define that experience, but we recognize it, right? And I think the more you are racialized as non-white, remember, it belongs to society, the issue of racism. It doesn't belong to certain people. So even though you're telling me right now that, okay, fine, you might be white passing, maybe certain behaviors, your beard, other things might tip it over, right? So depending on how you're racialized in certain contexts, things are going to be different, of course. people will feel it more. And obviously the affective surveillance is something that is inherently in the discussion we're talking about, the good Muslim, bad Muslim dynamic. Even me, who's highly aware of it, just because I end up thinking and writing about it so much, I constantly feel it. And I actually find it easier, let's say, if I'm presenting at a conference and I'm critical, let's say, of counterterrorism or counter-radicalization, or I'm critical of the type of things that people might be like, okay, where does this loyalty actually lie? Because the moment you start questioning, the way George Bush said it, you're either with us or against us. So the moment you start questioning state structures, it immediately puts up that question, is this guy a good Muslim or a bad Muslim, right? And so I've come to a point in my life where I'm just going to go ahead and say it, like I'm anxious talking about this. I feel anxious because all of your eyes, all your gazes upon me is going to play into this wider dynamic, but at the end of the day, that's the beauty of Duat Musa. What I find so beautiful about Duat Musa, and we often refer to Duat Musa, that fear that he had of going to speak to Pharaoh, which again, by the way, was repeated, that Allah recognizes that Musa was afraid while he's speaking with Pharaoh. So, that beauty of that sort of repetition is that recognition that it's not something like, oh, I recognize it before I start. Yeah, I recognize that I'm afraid of how people are going to judge me and how people are going to almost appropriate me in ways that I have no control over. But moreover, that it's sustained, it's always there. I think actually, in a way, it sort of bridges into this point of anxiety. If we're going to make a difference between fear and anxiety, fear being something, and I'm really, I'm being super reductionist here, but fear, let's say, is like a bear is attacking you. You get really scared, and Allah created you with this sort of embodied physiological response. You have this heightened sort of adrenaline, whatever it might be. You climb a tree, you don't even know how you're on the top of the tree, but you're there and you're looking down at the bear, and that was fear. Like that could be sort of what fear causes you to do. Whereas anxiety is you're walking through the woods and you don't know, you're afraid a bear might be there, but you can't see it. It might be behind any tree, right? And so you're in this perpetual state of uncertainty. And often people will talk about anxiety as this intolerance of uncertainty. But now if we bridge that into that sort of good Muslim, bad Muslim dynamic, and I think that's a really excellent question. It comes down to this uncertainty that, oh, will people accept me? Will people like me? It starts to reveal questions that are important about us. And I do find that anxiety is inherently something that's very revelatory about the things that are important to us. So if someone is anxious about that, and that's fine, right? Because we're not angels, it matters to me that I'm liked, that I'm accepted, etc. That people think I'm a good guy, I'm a good Muslim. The barakah, the blessing or the mercy that comes with that is that it puts it in the forefront if you're willing to hold on to it, whereby you can be like, okay, I need to renew my intentions here, right? That ultimately it's irrelevant, as is said in the Hadith Qudsi, if everyone hated you in the world, that's irrelevant. If Allah loves you, He'll cause the trees to love you, the birds, everybody will love you. It's really our relationship with Allah that should hopefully, inshallah, be that experience of, oh, I see people looking at me. Now I can translate that into sort of a spiritual experience, that I'm doing this for the sake of Allah. So I think there's something there about that sort of anxiety being actually quite meaningful. But as a whole, if we're talking about it in terms of mental health, then yeah, it can also be incredibly suffocating. It can be really suffocating. And I've met some people who I think who've really succumbed to that suffocation. They almost, it seems like almost obsessively have to prove themselves to be good Muslims. And I know such a brother who sees a therapist several times a week, a psychoanalyst. He's been seeking therapy for years and years, and now therapy a couple of times a week. But that issue has never gone away. And there's something about, I think, one's relationship with Allah, if one's able to translate that or not, inevitably.
So first I want to say, it's never been more clear to me the relationship between Islamophobia and addressing things like Islamophobia and racism, and the relationship between that and one's identity and their mental health. So I want to thank you for that. Jazakallah khair. Um, that's profound to me, because I do think that the way that we reduce Islamophobia to just something bodily or physical is reductionist, and I think you explained it in a really meaningful way, why that's not the case. I want to share quickly a passage that you shared from the piece "Suffering Unto God," which is on the Thinkbites website. You said the goal then would not only be revealing why we feel anxious, but also entering a relationship with that revelation, as it is the best means of connecting to God. As God created us weak, the closest we can reach God is through our very personal dreads. In the case of the student described above, we might discuss the significance of their anxiety in layers: the fear of failure, how the fear of rejection and therefore the fear of being unseen underlies a fear of failure, and how this is very real, profound fear of loneliness. How this very real, profound fear of loneliness is a reminder that one's relation to God has been severed. So I mentioned this, and I'm sure that you'll have comments and things and thoughts about that passage itself. And of course, there's a context to it that relates to an example of a student and some of their underlying experiences. So you can see that in the article on the website, thinkbites.org. It's the featured article right now, alhamdulillah. The point I wanted to mention there is the idea then that there are a lot of underlying and sometimes unseen concerns that weigh us down, and that add to this kind of, let's say, like our anxious state. And there's no doubt then, of course, that one of those things would be, our position, for example, as Muslims, as minorities in countries like the ones that you mentioned, in the West, in the global North, etc. Of course, also for Muslims who are not in these areas, there are other forms of let's say government imposed or government endorsed anxieties and whatnot that result in this threat. And so I really do think that that's something to consider, that there is, whether we're aware of it or not, there are huge systemic issues that are resulting in people feeling uncomfortable accepting their Islam. And one kind of connection I wanted to make to this was the idea that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, some of the early Muslims, when they accepted Islam, he would recommend to them that they keep their faith private. He would recommend to them that you continue to live as the person that you were before, until your faith is at a certain point, until the community is at a certain point. Some of those early believers, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created within them, for whatever reason, the strength and the resilience. And it's not to say that anybody who did not do the same is less strong, but it's let's say a different strength and a different just a different function that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala meant for them. But some of those early believers, they came out and they said, no, we are believers, and they were tortured for it. We know, of course, of people like Bilal radiallahu anhu, Sumayya radiallahu anha. We know that we know that many of these early companions, they were a little bit more open, or or their identity was found, but they experienced something more public. You know what I mean? And it wasn't meant for them to have it more private. But Rasulullah would tell some of them, no, keep your identity, low key. And I think the idea there is that your faith and the systems that it is forced to be within are definitely related. And subhanallah, number one, I think that points to the obligation that we have as a community to be in a principled way, working towards systemic changes, as opposed to believing that, righteousness and piety is going to emerge from a bubble. And I think for those of us who that works for, that might speak to privilege, or that might speak to a unique exception. But it's certainly not a sustainable norm that we should tolerate or that we should accept. And so I wanted to kind of just share that general reflection, and I'll leave it to you if you want to make some comments on that before I go to the next point.
Yeah, Barak Lafiq, I don't really have anything much more to add. I think, mashallah, that was a really important reminder. I think there's something to be said about the struggles that have been faced, the struggles that we face now. I think, there's differences, but there's definitely many commonalities. And I think one of the things that we often forget, and I'll just put this as a small, appendix. I think there was a recognition, obviously in the early Islam, that, the power of Muslims also comes through unity. I think that's a point that it's very difficult to determine right now how much of the issues we're going through, even through mental health, is a question of, okay, we sort of all have to have our own therapist, right? Ideally, there's 100 million Muslim therapists, and we each have our own therapist. And we're all going to go through our own struggles and have someone to talk to. Or there's this felt sort of sense of communion, right? Of like, we're all together in common issues that are affecting us all. And I think that I could talk a lot more about this, but I'm just saying that dynamic, we often, there's a lot in terms of the world today that's pushing towards the former, towards individualizing all our issues, towards, okay, we need to find that sort of that strength, that resilience, to be able to be well, be happy, self-help, and all these things that are developing through that. And actually working to work together towards common goals that affect everyone. And there's a wider point here to be said, but I'm just going to end it there.
Yeah. So in regards to that point, the question I think always comes up of, how do we address these issues and how do we solve these issues? And yeah, it's like, do we just need, does everybody just need a personal therapist, etc.? One of the questions, and I want to get to maybe some of the audience questions shortly, inshallah, because I'll be honest, I could sit here for hours, but I don't want to keep you too long, inshallah. But like legitimately, I mean, alhamdulillah. The side note here.
That's thanks to you, by the way. I mean, you're the one who's who's asking really great questions. I mean, if you ask the dumb questions that I told you to ask, then we wouldn't still be talking right now.
That's not even.
I got cake and other things waiting for me, man. I'm just waiting for the dumb questions so we can get it over with. No, but it's really a fantastic discussion.
I'm glad that you're choosing us over cake. I'll take that's a win in my book.
That is an honor I don't bestow upon many.
Alhamdulillah. Yeah, but I was gonna say, just as a side note, subhanallah, every time I have a conversation with you, I genuinely, like, it just opens me up. And I remember, like, last time that we talked, or almost every time I think I've talked, I was like, what's your recommended reading? You'll give me a good, alhamdulillah, beneficial recommendations that I still have not made my way through entirely, but I have read some. Jazakallah khair. One of those being the Viktor Frankl book that I think you also referenced in the article. Man's Search for Meaning. Man's Search for Meaning. I recommended it to my brother as well. He read it and he enjoyed it, alhamdulillah. So your recommendations make the rounds, alhamdulillah.
Yeah. By the way, that book I recommended to my brother-in-law, who doesn't read anything, and he read it. So it's, if anyone needed any sort of reminder that to read that book, I can definitely tell you that the people who I know who have never read any books have read that one.
Oh yeah, it's profound. Just the way that the author's writing style almost makes you feel guilty to not continue reading, and it's mesmerizing because his style is so, he's speaking about such heavy topics in almost like a nonchalant way, and you're like, wait, what? Like, how is
Yeah.
this going to continue to progress? And subhanallah, but yeah, it's a really good read. So the next point that I wanted to kind of just jump on a little bit was this idea of, you know, helping each other, etc. We'll often say, we'll often give kind of the generic advice of, like, you know, check in on people and reach out to your friends, etc. And then on the other side, you have this response of, you know, your friends aren't your therapists, you know, or like your sheikh isn't your therapist, etc. This is a big question, but what to you is the role of what role do we have to each other as, let's say, the average individual to their friends and their family, of contributing to their well-being?
Wow, mashallah, that was a really big question. So I'm glad that you told people they'll be here for a few hours. I mean, subhanAllah, it's actually perhaps not even that difficult of a question. I think we need to recognize that we have a moral responsibility onto others. Right? Allah is going to ask us about our neighbors. Allah is going to ask us about family, our friends. And I think that's inherently what makes sort of, you know, I tend not to name drop, like I don't want to draw too much in academic literature, but, you know, there's a sort of growing sentiment of thinking, like, as Professor Semen Said talks about, thinking about Muslim and Muslimness outside of like divisions of just nation states, right? I mean, how do we conceptualize the ummah? And one way of conceptualizing this ummah is like a wider sort of cultural, ethical group, you know, like it has a certain morality to it. And I think there's a morality that's inherent in, you know, regardless of sort of which denomination of Islam you come from or whatever, you know, there's a responsibility upon others. Allah might hold us accountable, which is also the point in the chapter that I wrote for the book I Refuse to Condemn, which again I'm plugging in because it's a really fantastic book. The point that I was trying to bring across in the chapter is that ultimately everything in the world is going to push us towards the gaze upon us, how we feel, you know, everyone looking at us. And inevitably, that's also where the word identity comes from. But if we can shift the concept of our identity around, whereby it's not like, oh, how I feel, oh, I ascribe to be Muslim, you know? It's not about like, oh, you see me as Muslim and therefore I'm Muslim, you know, or I choose to be part of a Muslim group. So it's this point of I. We can actually perhaps shift that around to this point of actually affirming other people that I'm Muslim because I see you. I see you, it's us, you know, I see you, Tarek, I see other people, you know. I think once we recognize that that's inherently the foundation of what binds us together, we'll go from a brother named Ismail Patel. He spoke recently. This really struck me, so I'm going to share this because I think it's so profound. And just to really maybe unpack something that you said very quickly, you know, if you find that our conversations have been inspirational, it's been both ways, but I've also been wrong in many, many different things. And I think what's important for us is also to be able to challenge each other in love, you know, to be able to come together and grow together. So one of the things that I learned from, one of the ways at least was phrased from this brother Ismail Patel, is that we have to go from politics of representation to a politics of responsibility as Muslims, which is sort of what I'm really trying to write about in general. All my writings sort of come down to that. Even when we're thinking about psychology, you know, everything in this world is going to push us towards representation politics. You know, it's going to be about representing ourselves in the best possible way, you know, to be seen in the best possible way to our neighbors, you know, that we're even seen in helping other people. Rather towards a point where, you know, like I have a responsibility now, to answer your question, I have a responsibility towards other people's well-being, right? And that is my politics. You see, if my neighbor is losing their job, okay, through cuts, through austerity policies. So there's budget cuts going on in public services. My neighbor is suffering because of that. It would be very reductionist for me to just say, well, you know, all I really have to do for my neighbor's well-being is feed them. That actually really doesn't fully help my neighbor. Like, it's just a way of, I guess, perhaps appeasing a certain guilt or whatever, certain responsibility. But if we're really taking politics and responsibility really, really seriously, we're going to try to understand and address all the reasons. I don't care if the neighbor now is Muslim or non-Muslim, is irrelevant. All the reasons why our neighbors are suffering, right? Through all the sort of structural conditions, which resulted in this person being in a place where, you know, they're financially insecure, they're unstable, they live in a perpetual state of precarity. You know, that is real, and that is real taking care of a person's well-being, you know, and people feel especially validated there. You know, if I were to just, if my neighbor is hungry, I just give him something to eat, I'm validating him at the most superficial level. The most superficial level is just this immediate point of hunger. But he's not an animal, right? He or she, they are not an animal, right? They are another human being with a soul. And a politics of responsibility would be one whereby their suffering is morally incumbent upon me to fully understand and to fully address as a Muslim. And that's something that we collectively have to be able to address as Muslims, which is why I think, you know, so many of these groups, mashallah, there's so many civil rights Muslim organizations, et cetera, that are growing, that I think are so significant, which are also being shut down for different reasons. But, you know, that is inherently what it means. Now, I'm going to make a small tangent because I think it's very, very easy to, sorry, I'm just going to move that light up, to reduce that question of our neighbor's well-being to a point of taking care of them, providing food for them. And I'm not detracting from that. I'm not detracting from the good that that brings. The only thing I want to say to that is that without unpacking this, everything in the world is going to try to push you to understand your responsibility towards others in such a way. Everything in the world is one about trickle-down economics. You have more money, give it to that person, you know? And it can play into the logic of Islam, obviously, as well, you know, providing sadaqah, etc. And that's great, alhamdulillah. But we can also think about our responsibility as Muslims towards ourselves and towards wider society in a much more complicated sense if we're willing to.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair. So, subhanallah, I feel like, yeah, anybody who has maybe did not see the relationship between, let's say, the moral imperative to be involved in addressing these issues and their relevance to us on a spiritual level, I think that really knocks that out of the park. Now, what if a person says, for example, for whatever reason, you know, they don't feel they have the capacity or the ability right now to help in that capacity, right? They're not able to, let's say, get involved with civil rights organizations or to, you know, they're all for, you know, the support, of course, the principled support of these organizations that are, you know, doing this beneficial work. They're just thinking now, what about the interaction between just two individuals? You know, now the systemic issues, those are all, of course, very relevant. Between two people, what is, let's say, and I know this is a question that, of course, in specific situations, different people need different things, right? But when I think about it from the perspective of, let's say, I have a friend who I see is going through clear challenges with, you know, their anxiety and their uncertainty and their burdens in the world. They're going through a hard time, or you know me myself, you know, I'm going through something like this. You know, what is the responsibility that my friends have to me as an individual, and what responsibilities do I have to another? And And I say this not in the sense of like the generic sense of, well, be good to each other, talk to each other, check up on each other. I think we all understand that basic level, and we don't need to, I guess, reiterate that too much. But maybe, I just think nowadays we've become so individualized, right? And not to say, not to go into the whole, we live in a society type thing, but the idea that like, yeah, people are exhausted and people are tired, and life is already hard. Is there something that, do I get something out of taking care of other people? You know what I mean? It's like, or of checking in on people. What do I have to do that? Why would I have to do that beyond trying to just to be a good person? It's like, is there something else there?
Okay, mashallah. I think that's a good question. I mean, why do you think, Tariq, we should be good people?
I mean, I can think of a million reasons, but I'm thinking about this from maybe the angle. So the question maybe is unclear, right? I'm thinking about it from the angle of, when people are going through a hard time, they have a hard time thinking about things outside of their own self. And a lot
Yeah,
of times, sometimes you'll see, we'll put out messages about the things that we want to see in the world, because these are the things that we want to see ourselves being done toward us. These are things that
yeah,
we feel we need. And so we put this message out hoping that somehow that energy will come back to us. Some with the continued buildup of anxiety and stress, and now even with obviously with COVID and whatnot, some people maybe are feeling a smaller capacity to stretch themselves and to
yeah,
volunteer their time to other people. And so beyond the imperative from just being a good Muslim, it's like, oh, because the reason why I say that is because as a believer, we let go of, unfortunately, a lot of things that we should do. And so it's very easy to think of, reaching out to other people or being kind to other people as just being one of those things that, it'd be good if I do it, but like, I'm just not that great of a person, and that's fine. That's, I'm fine kind of being, let's say, the bare minimum, you know what I mean? We almost then relegate then the relationship of care to something that must be in a therapeutic setting. It's like, well, if you need that, that's what therapists are for. That's what therapists
yeah.
and really superhero friends are for, not the rest of us, that's kind of the angle that I'm getting at. So it's like,
I don't
is
trust
there
superhero friends, by the way, just so you know. Anyone comes
I
to me
would
and
I
says
would
they're a
love
superhero,
I
I
would
don't
love
believe
to
you.
unpack that. I'd love to unpack that. But yeah. So your thoughts on, I guess,
I mean,
maybe
it's
that
a really
general
great
topic.
question. Yeah, I see. I understood you, and I think Jazakallah khair also for the clarification, because I think that also, like, it also inspired other ideas. I mean, okay, I think there's a moral point here, and then there's sort of like, I guess there's a structural point, and then there's like an individual point. So let's just go through all three. I think there's a moral point to be said that, um, you know, I think regardless of what technically we're going through, I don't know if that moral responsibility towards others ever goes away. That's the whole point of that politics of responsibility that I'm talking about. You know what I mean? Now, obviously, there's like footnotes. Obviously, there's no way to give sadaqah financially or whatever. There's other ways to help. SubhanAllah, I've met very inspiring people who have been going through a lot of hardship, right? And obviously, we're not talking about right now mental illness, things like that. But obviously, have been going through a lot of hardship, and their continuous state of being is always one whereby, okay, how do I fulfill that responsibility that I have towards others? And they might not, they might not intellectualize it as such, but I'm always apprehensive of a gaze. Not to say that it can't be legitimate, but I'm saying there's a point of apprehension or a point of like, when we have a gaze that turns it back exclusively towards ourselves. Okay, I need to sort of take care of myself. I can't do something. I have to fully take care of myself. Again, I'm not saying that doesn't exist or that it can be legitimate at times, because it obviously can be. You can't give something that you don't have. If you don't have time, you can't give it, right? So there's very simple ways of excusing that. The structural point, I'll have to say as well. See, this is really interesting because you are not the first person to bring this up to me. And it leads to some interesting ways of thinking about how we even talk about this. You know, I have a friend in need. Okay, so now outside of like sending them to therapists or being a superhero friend, right? I'm gonna bear all the weight. And by the way, I mean, subhanAllah, how many patients and clients have I had who are superhero friends to others, you know, but they're obviously seeking my support, and you can already feel it there. Well, what's going on in our relationships? That like one person is bearing a weight on one person, that other person then has to sort of unload weight on another, etc. And there is this lack of reciprocity. But I'm not saying that every relationship will be reciprocal, but there's something about how we are structured as people. To this is a statement made by, again, I'm gonna really, so this is the last time I'm name dropping anything, but there's a sociologist by the name of Bauman. He said a line that the first time I read it, I'm like, I closed the book, and I'm like, you know, this sort of, he encapsulated so much of the truth of how we work as society in this one line. And he said, we're no longer a community, we're a network of individuals. That's what we've become. So society has fractured people as to become, we're all networked, right? We're all sort of these individuals who are networked. So some people are privileged to have good friends. You know, that's the point of your super friends. That's the irony of it, is that person somehow is actually a blessing or a privilege that other people might not have, you know, or other people might not have, you know, the samhallah, good parents, you know, and we know exists, obviously. They might not have that blessing or privilege of being able to at least go seek a therapist or whatever, you know, like, but that's what it means to be a network of individuals. You know, you're really at the mercy of so many artificial structures. Whereas a point of community is that when my friend is suffering, it's not on my shoulders alone. I'm immediately in a state of mind. And I also try to be this, like I can't say I do this perfectly. But when someone comes to me, my first intention is that that person's not talking or speaking with me, they're speaking with a community. And I try to actually translate that some way, shape, or form immediately with the individual who requires help. I think you're coming to me, but you're actually just speaking to one face of a community. And the whole point is that there's a network, there's a support system that's invisible that you can fall back on. Okay. And I'm not saying that in the institutional like mental health sense, because the reason why I can't even say that, even if I wanted to, even if I believed it, the reason why I couldn't say it is because all those things are getting cut, right? Budget cuts, stuff like that. I can't promise that the NHS, you know, the National Health Services, like, you know, across the street is going to be able to take you up if you fall, because you know, the waiting time might be a year until you can see someone. Okay, so I can't promise that. But what I can promise is that hypothetically, as an ummah, that's what exists ideally, right? That's an ideal that I'm translating into reality just by affirming it, right? That I'm going to do what I can to translate that. So you see the difference here, whereby that responsibility is not mine. If that person falls, we as a community have a certain responsibility towards the members in our community that are falling, right? And we all bear that burden. Now, on an individual sense, of course, again, there's a lot about how policies have developed. And this is sort of the politics of mental health that in the Pandora's box that I'm not going to open, but I'm just going to say one point. A lot of policies have shifted towards wanting people to be able to do that for each other, this form of like individual sort of support system. We saw it sort of with COVID, right? We saw it here in the UK. I'm not so sure how much in Canada and other places, but you know, there was all about like, oh, community going out to support each other, sort of personal self-sacrifice. And that's great. Alhamdulillah, that obviously it shows the fitrah that we all have towards sacrificing ourselves. But I think it's inevitably, I think anyone who's listening who has a sort of mindset that I'm there to help other people, even if they are therapists, it's on me, it's my own shoulders, on my own shoulders. It's one which inevitably is incredibly taxing because, I think it takes back to that structural point, right? Whereby people suffering and all the causes of their suffering is one that belongs to the community. Um, I had more to say about the individual point. I think I'll just leave it there in case you felt like you wanted to be like a little bit more
So
specific.
sorry.
Oh, yeah. Let me. I think Zoom just cut off. No. It's cut off for me as well, but I see you on. Oh,
Oh, it's me. It's me on.
yeah, because I see you on Instagram.
My Zoom just totally crashed. SubhanAllah. Okay.
No, you're here. You're here. I just can't hear you.
Okay. I'm back on Zoom. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, it's all good.
Okay, I have no idea what just happened. My Zoom just literally just reset, subhanAllah, halfway through. Okay, so we're back. I hope, inshallah, that didn't affect anything.
I don't think so.
Okay, alhamdulillah. So, what was the last sentence that you said? Forgive me.
Was it about cake? No,
Probably.
there was something about it's about the community taking responsibility for people who are suffering in our community.
Yeah. So yeah, jazakallah khair. So I wanted to wrap this up basically with before kind of jumping into some of the questions, and we'll make the questions inshallah short. I won't keep you much longer than this. The first question I just want, or maybe the last note to just talk about this, because we mentioned the term anxiety a lot. Is there a short way to kind of or a simple way to distinguish between what we might call like a normal level of anxiety that we all experience? And when I say we all experience, I'm not saying, for example, all of us at all times, right? But because of course, when we know during certain times we're going to experience heightened, levels. But is there a difference between that and maybe something that you think, there's like a need to go see, somebody clinically, so to see a professional to get that dealt with? Is there a simple way to draw, a line between the two?
Yeah, that's a question I often get. So I'm going to try to say this as short as possible. I think a lot of the way, like the general anxiety that I've been sort of referring to, and clinically diagnosed anxiety, is actually very much an institutional question. So it really ends up being almost a point of being diagnosed really with anxiety, which can happen in different ways if you see a GP, if you see a psychiatrist, whatever. I think on an experiential note, the whole point I think you're also trying to get at is at what point that anxiety that we feel, let's say, of feeling like we're being watched, of just uncertainty, the uncertainty itself. If you feel so uncertain, what ends up happening is that you don't move, right? Remember that sort of the metaphor of a person being afraid to walk through the woods. Now let's imagine they have to go through the woods because that's how they get to work or that's how they get home. And they don't go through the woods. They don't see any bears, but they're anxious. So they're intolerant of the uncertainty. And we'll see a lot of that uncertainty being present, or the intolerance of uncertainty being present in anxiety. Now, what's interesting about that question is that it's often not a question of it being, how should I say this? So I was going to say phenomenological, but what I really mean to say by this is to say that there's no universal standard differentiating at one point anxiety becomes debilitating. The way it becomes debilitating is as I think very simply as the president of the orders, Quebec psychologist, simply stated it, is that, it's at a point where a person feels so uncomfortable that they want to see someone to talk to about it, right? Like, oh, this anxiety, this fear of not being able to go into the woods, that uncertainty that a bear might be anywhere, it could be in my fridge, could be in a car, that becomes so unnerving that they want to see someone. Or it becomes actually, and there's a point of capitalism here, but I'm just going to put it aside. It becomes debilitating in terms of their work or productivity. And often, by the way, a lot of Muslims and brothers and sisters, they come seek therapy, or they seek my consultation at that point where it's not necessarily because they're experiencing anxiety, but it's actually just that anxiety that they had been experiencing perhaps for a very long time had come to a point where it is debilitating. It is impacting their work, or potentially a relationship or whatever in some shape or form. So I don't think there's a real line. I think if someone feels like they really need to seek support or help for it, then they should. Obviously, I think that door should always be open, but it's never, I think, one for me to tell them to do that. I actually disagree with some of my colleagues. I remember back in the day, I had like other PhD students who are like, everybody should have a therapist, and there we see how therapy sort of, I don't want to get into this too long, but sort of it exchanged as a moral industry from the sort of confessional, everyone should have a priest or a pastor, everyone should have an imam, so now everyone should have a therapist. I disagree with that. I don't think a point of suffering is in and of itself one that we should medicalize or pathologize, whatever it might be. But, if a person feels like they're at a point where they're in need for any of XYZ reasons, because it's too much, because they can't make meaning out of it, because they can't return that suffering onto Allah, because it becomes debilitating because of XYZ reasons. There's a whole range of different reasons why that there might be a difference.
Jazakallah khair, Master Chief. Tarek, this has been an absolute pleasure. I honestly have way more questions to ask, and I think even some of the ones that I sent you earlier to just give you a little bit of a heads up, we didn't even get to, and maybe that would be a useful part 2 at another point, because I think we're pushing it close to 2 hours now. Alhamdulillah, it's almost Maghrib time for me. And so, maybe I'm certain that there's going to be interest to do this again, and so maybe we can do that if you would allow us the privilege. Well, I won't do it to you now, but expect in the coming months for me to nag you for another article, inshallah. This has been honestly really enjoyable, and there were some really good questions. I'm going to mention kind of 2 of them. And the two of them, and inshallah, and we can expand on future ones later. The first question was, assuming that psychology today suffers some level of secularization, at what point did the field of psychology experience this shift? She said, I'm not sure if secularization is the right characterization here, as it's always been a part of our Islamic tradition and other non-Western traditions, and a means of elevating the spiritual self. So basically the question is, when did this shift come that psychology has become viewed basically as this entirely secular type of thing? And if you have any comments on that, or even to challenge the question, of course you're more than welcome to.
No, I'm not. I wouldn't challenge the question. I think it's a really fantastic question. I think we need to, first of all, perhaps reverse the question on its head, that psychology inherently, the discipline of psychology, is one that only exists because of the secularization of Western society, of global North, right? And so that's how psychology developed as a field. And if you want to read a really great book on this, the author's name is Philip Cushman, and he wrote a book called Constructing the Self, Constructing America. It's a really thick book. He sort of goes into the history of how psychology sort of developed. There's other people who've written on this as well. Nicholas Rose, sort of the history of psychology and how it developed as a discipline according to sort of the secularized Western structures. But there's a side point here whereby then you're asking, well, psychology has always been part of Islamic tradition. So I think there's a here where we're sort of reverse engineering, you know, what we understand in psychology today, and then finding it back in Islam. And I think there's obviously there's a sort of meta reality where people have always suffered, and there's always ways of understanding things, questions of like, let's say anxiety, whatever it might be. But yeah, I think I'll just end it there. I mean, the point of and a means of elevating spiritual self, and I got the question in front of me right now. So we need to understand that point of elevating psychological self, whatever it might be, let's say 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, even in terms of, even if it might reflect the same sort of wording of what modern psychology is trying to achieve, we have to be very careful at assuming that those two were exactly the same goals. And there's a lot to be said about sort of the moral / ethical environment that the Muslim sort of Islamicate or Muslim world had existed in previously, that it can't be replicated here. And so the translation doesn't happen one-to-one in terms of elevating a spiritual self, let's say through psychology.
Yeah, so I guess when we're talking about, you know, let's say psychology in the Islamic tradition, we're using that word more for convenience as opposed to kind of complete accuracy, or like as a literal one-to-one comparison. The next question was, how does this impact the way that therapy and healing is carried out? How have therapy and healing frameworks been impacted by capitalism? We talked, I think, a lot about that actually, because this question was asked earlier on in the stream. But maybe that question then of to set that forward, then when we give this general advice of, you know, go to therapy, I guess it would be enough maybe to say that these elements are all interconnected, and that we should expect that if you go to somebody who doesn't, and let's say maybe the average individual, especially the average, let's say a non-Muslim professional in these fields, are not going to be aware of the way that these are interconnected and affect the average Muslim patient. And you know, as let's say Muslims who are looking for care, you want to maybe look for somebody who has a background in these fields. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely fair. So you'd probably, I mean, in general, I guess if anyone is seeking a therapist, they would want to find a therapist. If Islam, you know, is important to them as a value system, then they would try to find someone who shares that. I actually really love that question a lot. So Jazakallah khair, Aya, for asking that question. I mean, I know I've been alluding to it, so and I know that the stream time is short, so I'm just going to go ahead and say
stream time is not short. We're here on your time.
It's okay, I got cake waiting. So alhamdulillah. Okay, let me just double back on the last answer, which is I'm not making any comments or observations right now on Islamic psychology as a growing field. Okay, putting that aside. But you raise a very good question on the industry of therapy as a whole, okay? And I think there's something to be said about how therapy has developed as a product. It's not that it's tangentially related. Therapy has developed as a product of capitalism, individualism, neoliberalism. All these things have formed our understanding, not only of therapy, but of well-being, you know, what we're trying to actually achieve through therapy. I have an article coming out. It has been accepted, alhamdulillah, called Politicizing Muslim Mental Health Towards a Decolonial Movement in Mental Health. And the whole point of the article, which inshallah I don't know when it's coming out, but it's going to come out at some point early next year, inshallah. It addresses this exact question, which is trying to say, like, look, if we really want to take like an actual Islamic psychology or an actual Islamic therapy or Muslim mental health, we want to take that seriously, we actually have to be able to address these points of what therapy inevitably, even if you are Muslim, you have a Muslim therapist, inevitably the product is a Muslim who can go back to work, who's productive to society. Inevitably, you know, it ends up always falling back into a system that reinforces these ideologies of individualism, of capitalism, etc. With very, very small exceptions, and even those exceptions can be unpacked. So inshallah, just to answer that question very shortly, is that if anyone's actually interested in, I don't know how you can get in contact with me, you can do it through my website or whatever. I by all means, I can share with you the draft of the article as well, inshallah.
Inshallah. If there is something that could be publicly sent out, we could also send it out to anybody who attended this event, inshallah. But yeah, and if not, and if it's just, if anybody wants to indicate it to us, for example, you can let us know. Leave what should we tell them to respond? Respond to the email that we sent earlier if you want a copy of the article, and then we'll pass that along, inshallah ta'ala. Does that sound good?
Yeah, just for copyright purposes, it has to be a pre-final draft. So, but yeah, as long as people are okay with that, inshallah.
Fantastic, inshallah. So some of the folks from the Thinkbites team are responding. They're like, yeah, we want this. So yeah, if those of you guys who want it, send me your emails on the team Slack, inshallah. And for everybody else, please respond via email. Just indicate that you'd like it, and we'll pass it along, inshallah. And for those of you who are watching this for other purposes, maybe down the road, hopefully the article will be public by then, inshallah ta'ala. If it happens not to be, depending on when you watch this, send us an email, inshallah, and we'll get to you. The email is contact@thinkbites.org, inshallah. So we're gonna wrap it up over there. Jazakallah khair, Dr. Tariq, Master Chief. That's the preferred nomenclature. I apologize. Honestly, this has been a huge joy, and I'll gush a little bit more, inshallah, one-on-one, just to keep it classy. But no, barakallah feek. It was honestly a really enlightening session, and thank you so much for joining us, as well as for writing the article, of course.
Well, maybe just a final last thought. If anything that I said that was good and you benefited us from Allah, and anything that I said that was bad was for myself and my nafs. And of course, I'm always speaking in front of an audience, and there's a gaze there of people upon me. So I want to obviously appear as intelligent and whatever. And so there's a dynamic there which will never really escape. I think the best way of maybe at least mentioning something there is to say that, you should also think very critically towards what I'm saying. And that way we can actually perhaps move forward also, inshallah, as a community.
Absolutely. Jazakallahu khairan. Subhanallahumma bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk wal 'asr innal insana lafi khusr illa alladhina amanu wa 'amilus salihat wa tawasaw bil haqqi wa tawasaw bis sabr. Jazakumullah khair, everybody who tuned in. We'll be disconnecting from the socials. For those of you guys who are registered for the event, if you have any other comments or anything you'd like to leave in the chat, we'll try to take them. But Dr. Tariq, we'll let you go. Thank you so much for your time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.